Hello, dear viewer. I hope you'll forgive the delay in our correspondence. It appears that the forces of nature themselves have conspired to either sabotage my efforts, if not at the very least hinder them. Between family illnesses, emergencies, prior commitments, and even the corruption of captured footage, something, or someone, did not want me conducting my analyses this year. I was beginning to worry about whether or not I'd be able to return at all. But, as you can see, we are here at the end of the cold month of October, once again analyzing horrors old and new to determine which deliver superior scares or are merely frightful failures. Now, I hope you'll forgive me if today's offering does not deliver on my promise on something that is more mundane, but no less macabre. But because of these numerous setbacks, I've had to jump straight to what you, the viewer, wanted to see. You all cast your votes, and so here we are with the audience choice of analysis. Representing the old, we have the 1976 film The Omen, directed by Richard Donner. Representing the new, we have the 2006 remake, directed by John Moore. Rather than tempt fate, let us move straight into round one. What makes this analysis particularly interesting is that while both films had radically different visual styles, they both come from the same screenwriter, David Seltzer, and this is something you see right away when you compare them side by side. But as they say, the devil, or in this case his son, is in the details. While both films follow the same beats, the way they start marks the first difference. Both films make their intentions known during the opening credits, with the original setting its tone through simplistic imagery and ominous music. The remake, on the other hand, takes this opportunity to set the stage in a different way, as the film opens with the Vatican observing the signs that herald the coming of the Antichrist. It specifically tries to tie those signs to actual events, most notably the Columbia disaster, the September 11th attack on the World Trade Center, as well as the numerous natural disasters that have emerged as a result of climate change. While not stated by name, at the time of release we had just witnessed Hurricane Katrina, so naturally it was still a fresh memory. As a result, this opening makes the remake feel a bit dated. The original, on the other hand, jumps straight into the moment where Robert Thorne, played by Gregory Peck, has learned that his child was stillborn, conveyed via narration, which implies that he was told all of this before coming to the hospital where his wife, Kathy, played by Lee Remick, had the delivery. Here, it places greater focus on Robert and his plight, particularly how he and his wife have been desperate to have a child, and how the stillbirth is emotionally devastating. However, it's clear that the character has had some time to process the news, so he's not as emotionally distraught. This is in stark contrast to the remake, where Robert, played by Liev Schreiber, has rushed to the hospital after hearing that Kathy, played by Julia Stiles, had gone into labor. As such, we see him get the news upon his arrival, resulting in his emotions being a bit more raw, and thereby making him more susceptible to what happens next. Both films proceed with the priest suggesting that Robert take the orphaned child as his own, as he was born at the same time as his own son. Where this scene differs is that there's more of an effort on the priest's part to convince Robert in the remake, deflecting questions about his stillborn son and even telling him that God would forgive the deception. The original, on the other hand, offers no such dialogue, as it simply ends with the priest telling Robert that God has granted him a son. From here, both films move through the early part of Damien's childhood through montage. However, there are some key differences that set the films apart from one another. One difference is how Robert is moved from his position in Rome and appointed ambassador to Great Britain. In the original, it comes as a joyous announcement, a surprise appointment by the president. In fact, it's mentioned that he has close ties to the president because the two were college roommates. In the remake, Robert is appointed the deputy ambassador, only for his predecessor to die in a freak accident, leading to his secession. Another key difference is that instead of the president's roommate, he is the president's godson. As a result of these two differences, the original carries a more optimistic tone at the beginning. This is largely shaped by the fact that Robert appears to have a more active role in Damien's life. The remake, on the other hand, starts off with a more bittersweet tone. Robert doesn't appear to be as present and seems to carry the guilt of both lying to his wife about Damien and the fact that he became ambassador after the death of his predecessor. At this point, both films line up beat for beat, save for differences in overall visual style, which we will get to later. So for the sake of brevity, we're going to skip ahead to the parts of the story where they diverge most prominently. After the hanging scene, we are introduced to more key characters: Mrs. Baylock, Father Brennan, and the reporter Jennings. While the introduction of the latter two play out beat for beat between the two films, it's with Mrs. Baylock that we see some slight character differences. Firstly, in the remake, Mrs. Baylock, played by Mia Farrow, is introduced in a scene where Kathy is actively interviewing replacement nannies, meaning that they were actively searching for a replacement and aren't as surprised by her arrival. In the original, on the other hand, where she's played by Billie Whitelaw, her arrival is far more sudden. She appears out of the blue and advises them that she was sent out by the hiring agency shortly after the previous nanny's death as a preemptive measure. Her appearance also carries a far more ominous connotation when you see her first interaction with Damien, where she states that she's come to protect him. The films continue to play out identically from there, with Damien's meltdown upon being brought near a church, but here is where we get another key difference. As Kathy is being treated for her injuries in both versions, the dialogue plays out almost verbatim, with the exception being that Robert is the skeptical party in the original, whereas in the remake, it's Kathy. The exchange regarding the fact that Damien has never been sick is the same, but it's only the characters showing those doubts that has changed. In the remake, it comes across as Kathy still being rattled by Damien's sudden meltdown and outburst, whereas in the original, Robert is the one who is concerned with what might have triggered said meltdown. Both scenes convey the same information, but it changes the overall nature of the exchange, as it makes Robert appear a little more distant in the remake, which works to the film's benefit overall, as he's not as active a parent and misses out on a lot of the key moments of weirdness, which makes the fact that he's dismissive far more believable. After that, we have the incident at the zoo, which is where you see one of the biggest differences in overall tone and presentation. In the original, Kathy and Damien visit a zoo that has a guided trail that people drive down in their own cars. We get a little foreshadowing in how the giraffes run away at the mere presence of Damien, and is then followed up by the baboons actively attacking the car that Damien and Kathy are riding in. In the remake, things play out the same way, but at a much faster pace, with the various primates in the enclosure cowering from Damien before the gorilla attempts to break the glass. Here is where you see the biggest difference between the two films, and it is a critical difference. Prior to the rampage, you have Damien, played by Seamus Davy Fitzpatrick, state that the animals are afraid. This is in stark contrast to the original, where Damien, played by Harvey Spencer Stevens, doesn't say anything and simply starts to panic the way a normal child would in that situation. What this difference communicates in the remake is that Damien is already aware of the fact that he is the Antichrist. This changes the overall presentation of the story and the way in which it is told. Between all of the strange occurrences that surround Damien, the original presents them in a way that could be easily dismissed as coincidence. The meltdown is shown to be more akin to a child's tantrum. The scene in which Kathy falls down to the ground floor of the mansion is treated as more of an accident arranged by Mrs. Baylock, one that Damien promptly runs away from like any child who thinks they've done something wrong. Even in the film's final moments, Damien behaves the way a confused child likely would, simply hiding in the corner and barely making any noise, since he doesn't really know what's happening. With the remake, Damien carries himself like a miniature serial killer with a violent temper, seen with his various death glares prior to the meltdown, as well as riding his scooter with intention, as opposed to a simple accident. Like I've previously stated, it's as though he's already aware of his destiny as the Antichrist and what his powers allow him to do, which takes away some of the subtlety and emotional conflict of the story. By emotional conflict, I of course refer to Robert's plight as he notices the signs and coincidences and is ultimately pushed to the brink. In the remake, Robert is shown as someone who's distant and a little bit conflicted, wrestling with questions of whether he did the right thing, as well as questions of faith in general. In the original, Robert has a more active role, as he tries to do what he thinks is best for both his wife and Damien. He also shows a few moments of selfishness as well, as he tries to keep Kathy from aborting the second child that they had happened to conceive. Speaking of which, the original treats Kathy's decision as coming from a place of stress, as someone who's been run ragged by the burden of parenthood and cannot bear the thought of having another child. The remake, however, tries to play it up as more of a result of psychosis, stemming from the paranoid thoughts she is having about Damien being evil and her guilt over thinking such thoughts about her son. The other key difference here is that the remake treats the pregnancy as an anomaly, as they go out of their way in the beginning to say that her body was damaged and that her having another child would have been impossible, which feeds into Robert's inner turmoil. As Robert begins his investigation into Damien's origins with the reporter Jennings, the characters' overall arcs begin to line up, once again with lines of dialogue being reused almost verbatim. The last major difference appears at the moment where Kathy is killed. In the remake, Robert hasn't fully accepted what is happening and only learns of her death after trying to call her. In the original, on the other hand, Robert actively tries to save her by having an envoy from the embassy try to get her from the hospital in London to Rome, where he and Jennings are staying. Once again, he is a more active participant in the story. After Kathy's death, the film continues with Robert and Jennings making their way to the village of Megiddo and meeting with Bugenhagen, or Bugenhagen as it is pronounced in the original. Since these scenes are virtually identical, we're going to once again skip ahead a bit to the final moments of the story, where we notice one final difference. Both films show Robert outwitting the guard dog, finding the birthmark beneath Damien's hair, and the subsequent battle with Mrs. Baylock. From there, Robert takes Damien to the nearby church in an attempt to stab him with the daggers of Megiddo. In an odd moment of contrast, this is one point where the remake decides to slow down, as Robert takes one final moment to begin reciting the Lord's Prayer as his emotions begin to overtake him, the last lingering shreds of doubt before he begins pulling out the dagger and is ultimately shot before he can stab Damien. The original, on the other hand, moves very quickly. Robert doesn't even say the full prayer before he readies the dagger, and is shot down just as quickly. It's an odd choice to say the least, especially when you consider that the remake's extended ending actually does a much better job of this than what is present in the film proper, as it actually leads you to think that Robert might have succeeded as you hear the dagger thrust into the floor of the church. I'm not sure why they cut it, except maybe for time, but it's honestly a much better ending than what we got. But I digress. As similar as the stories of the two films are, when it comes to determining which is the superior version, I believe it comes down to the fundamental difference between the two films, that difference also proving to be a fatal flaw. While both films do away with any sense of subtlety at the outset, the original tries to get you to let your guard down at least a little bit, by pulling you into what is seemingly a normal family in a seemingly normal world. The remake, conversely, fully abandons the idea in favor of skipping straight to the scares. It also makes it clear that Damien is evil from the very beginning, instead of convincing us that he's evil over time like we see in the original. As I mentioned before, it makes it pretty clear that Damien is already aware of the fact that he's the Antichrist, but I'm not sure if that's a deliberate choice, or merely an after effect of the film being a remake that expects the audience to already know about the original. A problem that's only gotten worse in recent history. This is also seen most chiefly in how the original goes out of its way to explain the significance of 666, and its meaning in the Judeo-Christian tradition, whereas the remake assumes you already know what it is and what it means. As much as I enjoyed the remake, I'm going to have to give this round to the old. Its more subtle presentation and build-up make it a lot easier to relate to Robert's skepticism, not to mention that it also explains the elements that are important for you to understand in order to understand the story, rather than assuming that the audience had already done its homework. Now that we've discussed the story, this next round gives us a lot more to work with. Although both films are working from the same story by the same screenwriter, they present that story in drastically different ways. I'll be honest, when it comes to the atmosphere of the two films, I was a bit torn at first. When it comes to the visual style of the remake, it puts a great deal of emphasis on costume and color choices, at least at first. It starts with a slight layer of visual subtlety, with the use of red only being used for key visual elements, as seen during the hanging scene. It also makes effective use of shot compositions that result in some fairly striking imagery. Sadly, this visual subtlety all but disappears about 30 minutes into the film, which is a real shame. I'm used to remakes that put no thought into their cinematography, so this was a breath of fresh air, all things considered. The problem is that it gets way too heavy-handed in reinforcing that Damien is evil, almost like it's trying to beat you over the head with a red baseball bat with the word evil plastered all over it in bright reflective tape. As for some of the shots that don't involve Damien, the film does a good job of using the color red to flag certain characters, most notably Kathy. However, this is also overdone when you get to the cryptic dream sequences that are more or less put in for the purpose of working in a quick jump scare just to make sure that the audience hasn't fallen asleep. One thing I did like from the overall visual design that wasn't done to death was the use of black and white. Here, Robert is wearing all black, while Kathy wears all white. This is the same scene where Kathy raises concerns about how Damien has never been sick, and it works to subtly reinforce the fact that Robert is wrestling with the secret of Damien's origin, while Kathy is completely unaware. To quote Harry Plinkett, "You may not have noticed it, but your brain did." Another key highlight of color choice comes in the scene where Kathy is in the hospital after the fall, where Mrs. Baylock and Damien come to visit her. The hospital is all blue, with the only red coming from Damien's clothing, the red flowers carried by Mrs. Baylock, and the blood in the IV drip. It naturally draws your attention to the important elements, which works to keep you riveted as the air bubble injected by Mrs. Baylock slowly makes its way down the tube and into Kathy's body. When it comes to some of the film's less striking moments, it does employ its fair share of thematic lighting and color correction choices. This is seen most notably during Robert's interactions with Father Brennan, played here by Pete Postlethwaite. The scene that stands out is their final interaction, where the pouring rain leaves the scene with an overall blue tone, a similar color scheme we see later on as Robert and Jennings, played here by David Thewlis, conduct their investigation in Rome, most notably in the cemetery where Damien's mother is buried. This attention to color is something you don't really see in the original, but that's not to say that the original is without its own strong visual elements. The original film is shot in a style that is more akin to its contemporaries at the time, thereby looking like a lower budget film that has the hopes that the story will carry you through it, as opposed to the visual aesthetic. Some of the more haunting moments are conveyed through the use of lighting and cinematography, and even editing, as the film moves at a more brisk pace despite having the same runtime. All of the death scenes in the film are more sudden and jarring, and the gore is kept to a minimum, a stark contrast from the Final Destination-style deaths that the remake gives us. When Mrs. Baylock first introduces herself to Damien, we see warmer lighting on her face before we cut to a shot with a hard silhouette as the door closes. When they are preparing to go to the wedding, we see a clear focal separation between her and Kathy, the image composition implying this sense of dominance Mrs. Baylock is hoping to exert, showing that she is truly in control, while the one shouting commands is actually the weaker one. Another major difference visually is in the interactions between Robert and Father Brennan, played here by Patrick Troughton. Their first interaction is especially tense, as the two are the only ones in the room, with Troughton's character looking a great deal more deranged and unstable. When looking at their final interaction in the park, it's again shot in a more contemporary style, taking advantage of what the location had instead of constructing an environment in and of itself. However, it's here where things also take a more eerie turn. In the remake, it's already raining, so the idea of a thunderstorm isn't out of the realm of believability. While Father Brennan still avoids the strikes of lightning and tries to run to the church, it's not as out of the ordinary when compared to the original. Here, we go from broad daylight to a storm appearing out of nowhere. No rain, just thunder and lightning that has materialized literally out of the blue. This makes the phenomenon seem a great deal more ominous. Another issue with the overall presentation of the remake is the lack of subtlety. This is best seen when comparing the meltdown scenes from earlier side by side. In the original, you see Damien looking at the church, and you see a slight montage of the building's architecture and the statues adorning it, all things that can be seen from where Damien is sitting. The remake, on the other hand, uses a montage of random religious iconography, imagery that he, as a character, would have no way of seeing from where he's sitting, and is done more for the benefit of the audience. As I've mentioned before, both films abandoned any attempt at subtlety from the very beginning, but at least the original doesn't spell things out for the audience early on like the remake does. Aside from that, there's also one thing that tips the scales against the remake, and that would be the way the final scenes of the film play out. Once again, they follow the same beats and even reuse the same shots, but the remake is shot and edited in a manner befitting an action film rather than an atmospheric horror film, seen chiefly when Robert outwits the dog guarding Damien and when he kills Mrs. Baylock. In the original, Robert outwits the dog slowly, by tricking it into thinking he went into the basement and closing the door on top of it. The remake, however, treats this as more of a set piece. Yeah, Robert prepares himself, but it feels more like a spur-of-the-moment decision rather than a slow, deliberate plan. That said, this isn't nearly as egregious as the fight against Mrs. Baylock. In both films, after revealing the birthmark, Mrs. Baylock lunges at Robert. In the original, the fight spills into the kitchen, leading to an intense grapple as both try to stab each other with whatever they can grab. This leads to a very slow but decisive death as Robert ultimately overpowers her. How does the remake finish her off? Robert runs her down with his car, and she flips over it and lands behind it like a rag doll. This moment caused me to pause the film as I waited for the fit of laughter to pass. My suspension of disbelief immediately shattered. Am I an awful human being for finding this funny? Probably. It didn't help that the preceding moments were conducted like an action set piece, and so this moment just feels so out of place when compared to the rest of the film itself. While I've already discussed the narrative differences with the ending, the shots that we're given are virtually identical from here on out, right down to the final shot of Damien smiling at the camera. The last major difference is that the original ends on a quote from the Book of Revelations, while the remake just goes to the credits. Like I said before, I enjoyed the remake when I first watched it. That said, after looking at the original, it is really hard to maintain that fondness, when you consider that the original took its time where it needed to, and planned out its more harrowing moments more carefully. While it may not have had much in the way of budget, particularly with the effects, it took the shots that it did have and made them count. The remake does have its merits, but someone needed to step in when some of the visual elements were getting out of hand, most notably the dream sequences. As such, this round once again goes to the old. There's not much point in having a third round since the winner has been conclusively decided, but I don't want to give you the impression that the remake is a horrible film devoid of any value. Far from it. The careful shot compositions and color choices show that there was a great deal of care put into this film, more than can be said for the other horror remakes I've looked at on this show. Its biggest failing, however, is the fact that it tries to portray Damien as someone who is already aware of his powers and his ultimate destiny. While that is an angle I can appreciate, it leaves the film feeling restricted by its loyalty to the source material and robs the story of this slow boil of tension. To Seamus's credit, he really sold it, as he comes across as incredibly unnerving. If the film took a few more risks with this approach, it probably would have left more of an impact. With the original, while it opens with as much subtlety as a street preacher with a megaphone, it at least portrays Damien as a normal child, which allows for his parents' skepticism to be more realistic and understandable, which works well for a story where a man is slowly convinced that his adopted son is the son of Satan. If you've never seen the original, you'll enjoy the remake like I did when you watch it the first time all the way through. It's intense, unnerving, and has good pacing for the most part. I'd like to think that this is probably what you would get if you filtered the story of the Omen through the lens of the Da Vinci Code. That said, if you've seen the original, then there's nothing you really gain from watching the remake, since it's more of the same. It was close to greatness and makes for an interesting study in how to use color in a given scene, but the overall experience of terror pales in comparison because the remake played it too safe. This clash ends in favor of the original version of The Omen, the superior film. With that, this episode of MonsterClash now draws to a close. Join me next time as we take a look at something that is a little more interactive. But for now, dear viewer, I bid thee good night.